One approach to the study of death and dying, especially amongst ancient populations, is the subdiscipline of bioarchaeology. So, what is bioarchaeology? Well, it is the interdisciplinary and problem-oriented study of human remains from archaeological contexts. So, when I talk about interdisciplinarity, we are drawing on a number of different disciplines to answer questions about the past. So, we will step through many of these subdisciplines that are listed here and types of analyses that are conducted within bioarchaeology in this lecture. And in terms of being problem-oriented, we're focused on specific sorts of questions. We're trying to learn about the past, learn about how populations died, how they treated their dead. But something to keep in mind is this reflexivity. So society and the individual are always sort of working off each other and changing over time. Another thing to keep in mind is our knowledge of the past comes at a cost in some cases. This is felt most directly by descendant communities who are related to the people that might be investigated, and they can see this as a sort of disruption of the deceased when burials are disturbed. But the other sorts of questions we can look at individuals, learn about their lives and how they died, as well as the sorts of identities that they might have imbued within their life. So we can learn quite a bit, actually, from the deceased individual and their society by studying the human skeleton, studying the burial context from which they are discovered. Things like their age and sex, if they suffered from any kind of disease or trauma, and also their diet. So some pretty interesting questions that we can investigate. One of the first sort of things we can address is the topic of paleodemography. And so to do this, bioarchaeologists use biological information from the graves and the cemeteries themselves to describe many characteristics of a population. This is an ideal sort of situation that you would just get all the information you can from grave markers or historic records, but not everything is always written down, and not everything is always accurate that's written down. So it's really important to actually look at the material culture and the skeletons themselves. So how do we do that? How do we reconstruct the size and dynamics of a past population? Well, in terms of the age of an individual, there are certain measurements that we can look at on a person's body. So these are the openings in the pubic bones, so the hip bone area of individuals. Also, different dentition patterns that develop over time are very indicative of a person's age at death. In terms of their sex, we can look at the opening of the pelvic structure again. For females, it tends to be a much wider opening than it is for males. Go figure, because they're the ones that actually birth babies. Also, though, there are other kinds of markers on a skeleton, on the crania specifically, that we can look at that tend to be more hyperfeminine to hypermasculine along this sort of continuous spectrum. And these certain measurements or characteristics of the skeleton itself help us to determine the person's sex. We're also able to look at mortality and fertility rates. So pretty obvious that mortality is the number of deaths in a particular population over some span of time, typically on an annual basis. Can't always get at that scale. And then obviously fertility is the number of births that we're having in a population. Important things to keep in mind when you're looking at these sorts of ideas, though, are any segments of the population missing from your data set? And what can that sort of pattern tell us about the culture itself? So, for example, if we saw that there were no infant burials at all, well, we know it's pretty common in past societies that there were high infant mortality rates. So maybe the infants themselves are being buried elsewhere, or their bones are actually so fragile they might not preserve and make it into the archaeological record. So you can't just take everything at face value. You have to really dive into what else could be contributing to these patterns. Paleodemography also allows us to look at migration patterns and the geographic extent of different, culture areas, as they were been called in the past. Areas where we see similar cultural traits that are shared. Burial practices themselves, if there's extended burials or flexed burials, inhumation versus cremation, we see trends and differences, even here in the Southwest, aligned with these different archaeological cultures. We can also look at population density. This is, the size of a burial area of a cemetery, the number of individuals there, depending on the length of time we think that a site has been occupied. We can get a sense of increases and decreases in the density of population in different places over space and time. When it comes to mortuary analysis itself, so this is the study of the material evidence surrounding death and burial. It allows us to characterize the mortuary contexts themselves. So is it a pit burial? Is it a formal tomb? These have different sorts of meanings within different societies. Types of questions we might want to think about are, how did the past people think about death? How did they interact with the dead? What sorts of funerary practices can we discern from the material evidence? A really important one, or not necessarily important, but interesting question we can ask is, was there social inequality in the past? So do we see differences in the differences in the amounts of goods or types of goods that are buried with different people? And if we do see patterns like that, if we were to see a very young child with, all this wealth that they're buried with, well, that means that the social inequality might be a bit hereditary in terms of a young person doesn't have much time to accrue importance in society unless they're born into it and then die quite young. The site where I worked at for my dissertation is La Quemada down in Zacatecas, so just bringing this in as a quick example. There are several different types of mortuary contexts within the site itself, especially in terms of the display of human remains. We see evidence of what are called zompantlies or skull racks, and we can determine this based on, finding the holes on the tops of the heads or the sides of the heads, like you see in the middle figure there, that would have allowed the skulls themselves to be put on display. We also have evidence of bundles of remains that may have been, sort of venerated ancestors that they visited and left offerings to on a semi-regular basis. Paleopathology, this is the study of medical disorders and injury in the past. The health status of past populations can be investigated by recording the nature or the condition of the bones themselves, if there's any trauma that affected the skeleton, for example, any bone fractures, arthritis, or periodontal disease. Nutritional problems can also be reflected in bones and the bone growth. Cause of death, however, can only be determined for a pretty small small percentage of burials. The questions we might want to talk about are, what kinds of diseases affected past populations? How did disease spread? Were individuals who became sick cared for? So do we see someone with a leg fracture that heals and they're able to get back to a semi-regular life? Well, if they were out there on their own, they probably would have succumbed to that injury because they weren't mobile enough to move around or feed themselves. When it comes to thinking about the health of past populations, it's a bit tricky, and we'll get into that in another slide or two. So paleopathology itself, it's an extremely detailed study of human remains. We're looking for skeletal indicators of stress and disease that would have either ended a person's life or we see that they would have suffered from for several years. This slide includes several different examples, syphilis in the bottom left corner, and tuberculosis, which affects the spine over time. These are the sorts of things that bioarchaeologists can look for and draw interpretations of ailments that person might have suffered from. So this brings us to what's called the osteological paradox, and as I said, this question of health can be quite tricky in some cases. There are different diseases that might cause identical reactions, which actually makes them indistinguishable when we only have the skeleton of that person left. So other diseases that don't actually affect the skeleton at all, well, we're not going to be able to trace that in the archaeological record. The trickiest part, or trickiest example that I could bring up then, is that skeletons of individuals who die from a disease before it can actually affect their bones would actually appear to be healthy. So, for example, if we had three subpopulations within a community that are exposed to a disease that risks death and causes skeletal lesions. Well, there might be one population that none of the individuals are affected by the disease. The second population within the community might experience the disease, they're sick for a while, and develop these sort of characteristic bony lesions that can be observed by the bioarchaeologists in the future, but they survive. So we see that they were able to recover and lived a longer life beyond having suffered from the disease. Well, there might actually be a third population within that community where everyone experienced the disease and they actually succumb to the disease before those bone lesions are able to manifest. If we're left with only looking at the archaeological record, then the population that never experienced the disease and the population that was killed by the disease before those skeletal stress markers can form, well, they're going to look exactly the same in the archaeological record. So how are we going to be able to tell who was healthy and who died because of a particular disease? So important things to keep in mind. We're also able to trace evidence of violence and trauma in the past. You might be wondering how violent was the past. Can we actually reconstruct the sequence of events that led to someone's traumatic injury? In La Quemada, where I work, we actually see evidence of the processing of human remains even after death. So the removal of flesh from bones leaves certain sort of cut marks, like what you can see in the upper right image here, on the bones themselves. Other sorts of traumatic injuries in the past will leave very obvious indicators. If you see a bullet hole in the top of someone's head, for example, that might be evidence of how they died. We do see evidence of treatment of injuries in the past, so surgeries that would have taken place, as well as the remains of bandages and other sorts of medicinal tools. Many people are interested in looking at rates of interpersonal violence that can change over time, and often they look also for other sorts of social or environmental factors that would have influenced fluctuations in this type of interpersonal violence. When it comes to biological affinity, this is the study of how closely related people were in the past. So that involves individuals as well as groups. So you can compare group to group. The sorts of methods that are used include craniometrics, so measurements on the bones themselves, especially within the crania. We also nowadays, though, can look at nuclear and mDNA to determine how people were actually related, and also gets into descent systems, through matrilineal, patrilineal descent. Obviously, these data can then help us understand how past societies were organized and whether or not burial practices are reflective of kinship patterns themselves. That brings us to isotopic analysis. So there are certain elements in the environment, so carbon being one of them, and you're seeing the carbon cycle here on the right. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, strontium, these are elements that get absorbed into organic materials, and that includes us as human beings. When a person dies and we have their skeletal remains later on, we can look at ratios of the different isotopes of those elements to actually assess dietary patterns as well as migration patterns amongst human and animal populations. we're also able to learn quite a bit about paleoclimatic reconstruction and the effect of any kind of environmental change on organisms over time. Another example then is strontium, which comes typically out of the bedrock of an area. Bioarchaeologists are able to collect natural water samples, plant samples, and rock samples to get these sort of baseline information, and then they compare the skeletons of those individuals to those baselines to determine, well, are they local? Did they live here for most of their life, or had they migrated into this area at a later stage in their lives? Questions would include any kind of dietary differences that we might be able to associate with social status, and again, the mobility of different populations. Isotopic analysis can be conducted on any sort of organic material, so bone, skin, hair, tooth, or plants themselves. And these are some photos from a colleague of mine who actually studied his dissertation on macaw burials here in the Southwest and seeing where they came from and how they ended up in the Southwest. Lastly, there's forensic anthropology, and so this is a subdiscipline that involves the application of bioarchaeological methods within a legal setting. So these are people who are involved in the recovery of remains, identifying victims, reconstructing how someone died, and then eventually going into legal proceedings as an expert witness and providing testimony to the analysis they were able to conduct. So as I said, bioarchaeology is very much interdisciplinary, and one of your readings for this week is by Larson, and so you will see many of these same types of analyses used in his approach to the bioarchaeological analysis at La Florida. So that brings us for your activity for this week, and we are learning about the La Florida Bioarchaeological Project, which is directed by Clark Spencer Larson. It's a great example of how bioarchaeology and ethnographic analogy can be used to help us understand the lives of people in the past, as well as the factors that may have contributed to their death. So I want you to consider the questions below while reading Larson's article, and then submit your answers through Canvas by the end of the week. I would encourage you to discuss the activity with your classmates. You can go ahead and start a thread in the questions or concerns discussion board for this module, but each student must submit their own unique responses. So feel free to collaborate and talk about things, but in the end, everyone's responsible for submitting their own assignment.